Today we're going to discuss a little bit about the principles of nutrition education. In other words, this is how you're going to design your intervention. An effective nutrition intervention program is going to both integrate good instructional design and learning principles. As we already know, those are based on behavioral theory and using the mediators of that theory that are appropriate for your audience based on a needs assessment. And then also using media that facilitates a high degree of individualization. And what I mean by that is really making it specific to your audience and interactive. In order to do this, you really need to consider who your participants are, not only their styles of learning. You want to be sure that your program is constant, relevant, individualized. It provides feedback, reinforcement, and facilitation. And we're going to talk about all of these things. Being culturally minded can help you pay attention to each of these criteria as you design your program. In other words, applying these educational principles really depends on your audience and will vary from audience to audience. Understanding culture and being culturally competent is critically important to understand when developing a nutrition education session or intervention. Obviously, culture is a very strong part of people's lives, and it influences their views, their habits, and all of the ways that they conduct themselves in society. So an appreciation of diversity goes hand in hand with achieving behavior change, because individuals don't always change the same way. Sometimes we can see trends, and that's why we apply behavior change, because we know that there are a set of mediators that work to push people toward behavior change. But the combination of mediators that you use is going to vary from person to person and from culture to culture in general. Different cultures hold different values, and knowing what's valuable to a person or a culture will make an intervention targeted at that person or culture more effective. So consider for a second, what is your culture? Another word for culture here could be identity. Take a minute to think and list all of the cultures and identities that describe you. How many can you come up with? Pause this video if you need to. In your short list, you might have considered your religion, nationality, race, sexual identity, ethnicity, occupation, marital status, blah, 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 all of this on this list. There are other things on this list that might be part of your identity. If you're male or female, if you're disabled, if you're from an urban or rural area. I'm soon going to identify as a parent for the first time in my life, so that will be a change in my identity. All of these different various identities are both cultural and social. So it's important to develop culturally relevant and socially relevant programs for individuals and groups, and to be culturally competent leaders. And what I mean by a culturally competent leader is being able to meet the needs of individuals from different cultures because you have an understanding and appreciation of the values, norms, and traditions within those cultures. Materials that are culturally relevant are critically important to connecting with these audiences. One of my favorite examples is when I was working for the Stellar Farmers Market, which I have talked about before. I was part of its pilot program 7 or 8 years ago now, and they had us going into various neighborhoods teaching nutrition education workshops and conducting cooking demonstrations at farmers markets in primarily Hispanic neighborhoods. So they would have me, for instance, go in and teach Hispanic women how to cook beans. Obviously, you know that I am not the person to go in and teach Hispanic women how to cook beans. They can teach me a few things about cooking beans. So those materials, those lesson plans, at first were not particularly culturally relevant. New York City and the surrounding areas are obviously extremely culturally diverse, and it's important to understand culture as a means for relating to others. And in nutrition, we serve every audience and every cultural group that exists that you might run into in New York City. In nutrition and dietetics specifically, not only are we interacting with all of these individuals, but our interaction plays a role in the satisfaction of our patients and our clients. You can see in this graph here that the proportion of people who believe they would receive better health care if they were of a different race or ethnicity is extremely high for everyone except for white people. This indicates to me that the practitioners they were working with were not particularly culturally competent, that they didn't make sure that their patients received equal, fair treatment or care that was appropriate for their needs or their culture. There are many important skills that you need to develop as a culturally competent educator. You need to be able to understand a group's dietary preferences and food habits, which hopefully you remember from a class like 220. You need to have a working knowledge of the nutritional composition of foods unfamiliar to a practitioner. So these can be basic things, knowing that yuca is starchy vegetable, that yuca and cassava are the same thing. This is kind of general knowledge that you should be familiar with. You should definitely possess an awareness of the role of family members, because family members and social support, as we know from going over health behavior theories, are critically important. And in certain cultures, members of the family are responsible for the food environment, and or members of the family are responsible for health care. So knowing if these are one and the same people or what role each family member plays is incredibly important. Of course, the same goes for religious beliefs. And lastly, having an awareness of your nonverbal communication is critically important. We have standards in Western society of how we're going to interact. We tend to shake hands with strangers. We don't hug. We don't kiss. We tend to make direct eye contact. Other cultures do not. And so if you really want to maximize your cultural competence and your interaction with patients and clients from different places, then you want to be aware of the general social rules that dictate how you interact with somebody. Let's look at two examples of how this might work. So the first one is about cassava. In the US, cassava flour is referred to as tapioca. So this is probably a food that you're actually familiar with, but you might not be as familiar with the name cassava. So knowing that these two are actually one and the same would benefit you as an educator when working with anyone from sub-Saharan Africa or South America. On the other hand, you may not have heard of fried chitterlings. And if you weren't familiar with this food, you might not realize that nearly all of the calories in fried chitterlings come from fat. So this would be critically important when working with any African American with heart disease or with obesity or metabolic syndrome. So there are specific culturally centered approaches that you can take. You want to value diversity by respecting backgrounds and ways of life. You want to be able to apply and institutionalize cultural knowledge in your intervention. So this means that you, as the person designing the intervention, is not just aware of these things when you write it. You want it to be part of your intervention. You want anybody else to be able to pick up this intervention and know that it was written with a specific cultural group in mind. And of course, you need to be able to adapt to the diversity and cultural contexts of the community being served. So your intervention, for instance, might indicate where a specific cultural food or a cultural approach is being taken. As a nutrition educator, there are also some culturally centered characteristics that you can try to embody or practice. Here's a list of about 14 of them. And thinking about what this list means to you is really important. How do you listen carefully? How do you tolerate uncertainty and practice patience? I think these are all things that we want to be able to do on a regular basis, not only in our work, but in our personal lives. But it's not always easy. If you are able to operationalize these things and put them into practice, then your clients or patients will feel valued and more comfortable with you. They'll have the confidence to share their thoughts a little bit more, and they'll trust your input in making decisions about their health and the health of their families. So it's critically important to make them feel valued and comfortable in order to have the best possible outcomes. And as I started mentioning a couple slides ago, nonverbal behavior, just as much as verbal behavior, is critically important. There are many stereotypes and types of discrimination, some of which are subconscious, and we need to be as aware of as much as possible. There's also judgment that happens in many of our statements, and all of these barriers result in stress. And stress doesn't foster a very helping relationship, the type of relationship that we want when we're working with individuals or groups. Immigrants who come here and are relatively new, or even if they're second or third generation, may not be fully acculturated to American society. And this is where cultural competence becomes critically important. If someone has become acculturated, then that means that they have really adapted to an American lifestyle. The process of acculturation involves many different degrees of learning and is a fluctuating process that transpires over time. So one doesn't just become immediately acculturated. There are ways that this happens, and it happens over a period of time. Some examples of this are using a name that sounds more American or more English, consuming a more American diet, or wearing more American style clothing. If someone is highly acculturated, they've taken on many American qualities or ways of life. The degree of acculturation matters for how you're going to interact and be sensitive to a patient or to a client. And there are 4 acculturative strategies. There is assimilation, separation, marginalization, and integration. Each of the definitions are on this slide. In general, the acculturative strategy reflects the attitudes or orientation that an individual assumes toward the culture of origin and toward the other group or culture that they're assimilating into. And we can think about acculturative strategy in a slightly different way. So when somebody has a positive attitude toward keeping their heritage and a positive attitude toward learning their new culture, then that is integration. When somebody has a negative attitude toward keeping their heritage but a positive attitude toward the new culture, then they're becoming assimilated. If somebody has a positive attitude toward keeping their heritage and a negative attitude toward learning their new culture, it's separation. And then both negative attitudes are marginalization. So you can imagine when a person feels marginalized, they're showing little involvement in maintaining their culture of origin or in learning a new culture. They probably feel extremely isolated. Working with this person in either a clinical or community setting, you would want to know that going in, and that might help you better tailor your response and your work with that person. There are several stages of acculturation. During the first stage, there's initial enthusiasm for the new place. This is called the honeymoon stage. This is usually when people feel optimistic about the new place that they are and the new opportunities they're presented with. Often that's followed by a second stage that's considered culture shock. Their idealistic views about the new culture are starting to be broken down a little bit. They might feel depressed and isolated, and they might, as a result, feel very hostile. Often the second stage of hostility turns into humor. So this is kind of a recovery stage where people begin becoming more integrated in society, speaking better English and understanding more, communicating with their peers. And during the last stage, the home stage, this is really where somebody feels integrated. They might be still hanging on to their culture, their home culture, and become integrated into their new culture. They probably value both and different aspects of both. Going through this process doesn't take a specific period of time. It varies for different people and for different reasons. So you can never just assume that somebody has gone through this process when you're working with them. And you can follow cues to determine where they are in this continuum of acculturation. In terms of food, this is really important because if you move from a drastically different society to America, then you might find that the diet is extremely different. Who cooks in the household might change, how meals are served might change, health conditions might change as a result, and it's important to note that the role of health professionals is viewed differently around the world. We don't all practice Western medicine. And so you, as a dietitian, might not be viewed the same way by people of different cultures. So to conclude this section on cultural relevance, it's critically important to consider who your audience is when you're designing an intervention. You want to be sure to include culturally relevant materials and make sure that your intervention takes a culturally competent approach to nutrition education.